The moment Clint Eastwood spoke those 6 words to Marcus Dalton on the morning of September 17, 2018, everyone on the set of the Nevada desert production knew that a career had just ended, though it would take another 48 hours for the rest of Hollywood to understand what had happened in that dusty parking lot outside the Silver Basin Ranch at precisely 7:42 in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to burn off the night's cold, and the crew was assembling near the catering trucks with their coffee and their quiet conversations about whether today would be the day that someone finally said something to the actor who had spent the last 3 days treating their work like a joke. Marcus Dalton was laughing when Eastwood approached him, actually laughing with his hand on the shoulder of a young production assistant named Kevin Morse, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the desert sand. And Dalton was in the middle of another one of his performances, another one of his elaborate mockeries of the script that had been written by a 73-year-old screenwriter named Bernard Colfax, who had spent 2 years researching the true story of a deputy marshal in 1883, who had walked alone into a mining camp to arrest a killer and had died doing it. And Dalton was doing his version of what he called the theatrical reading, where he added absurd voices and gestures to the dialogue, treating the marshal's final words to his wife like they were lines from a carnival barker. And Kevin Morse wasn't laughing, but he was trapped there. And the other crew members within earshot had stopped their conversations and were watching with that particular kind of tension that comes when you know something is wrong, but you're not in a position to fix it. And that's when Eastwood walked over from the director's chairs, where he had been sitting with the cinematographer Roger Valdez, going over the day's shot list. And Eastwood moved with that economy of motion that came from decades of understanding exactly how much energy a situation required. And he walked right up to where Dalton was performing his little show, and he waited until Dalton noticed him, which took longer than it should have because Dalton was so absorbed in his own entertainment. And when Dalton finally saw the director standing there 3 feet away watching him with those eyes that seemed to contain entire landscapes of judgment, Dalton made his fatal mistake by assuming that Eastwood would need some kind of explanation or justification, and Dalton started to say something about how he was just loosening up before the day's work, about how actors need to play with the material to find their truth, about how the great method teachers always said you had to break down a script before you could build it back up. And Eastwood let him talk for maybe 10 seconds, which was 9 seconds longer than anyone who knew Eastwood would have expected. And then Eastwood said the 6 words that Marcus Dalton would hear in his head for the rest of his life. 6 words that were delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, but which carried across the desert morning like a rifle shot. 6 words that ended not just the conversation, but the entire trajectory of what had been until that moment a promising career. But to understand why those 6 words had such power and why they were delivered at that particular moment in that particular way, you have to go back 3 days earlier to when Marcus Dalton had first arrived at the production with his reputation and his assumptions and his fundamental misunderstanding of what kind of set he was walking onto. The production was called The Long Valley, and it was based on a true incident from 1883 when Deputy Marshal James Corrigan had traveled alone to the White Rock mining settlement in what was now central Nevada to arrest a man named Samuel Pike, who had killed 3 people in a dispute over a claim boundary. And the story was simple in the way that true stories often are, which is to say it had no wasted moments and no false drama. Just a man doing his job because the job needed doing, and dying because sometimes that's what happens when you do the right thing, in a place where might makes more sense than right. And Bernard Colfax had written the script with that same stripped-down clarity after spending 2 years reading Corrigan's letters to his wife Martha and interviewing the descendants of people who had been in White Rock that day and visiting the actual site where Corrigan had been shot and had bled out in the dust while the townspeople watched from their windows. And Colfax had given the script to Eastwood because he knew that if anyone would understand what the story needed, it would be the director who had spent 50 years making films about men who did their duty without complaint. And Eastwood had read it in one sitting and had called Colfax the next day to say they would make it. And they had assembled a crew of people who had worked together before. People like Roger Valdez, who had shot 4 films with Eastwood and understood the director's preference for natural light and minimal coverage. And like the first assistant director, Patricia Hammond, who could run a set with the precision of a military operation while maintaining an atmosphere of mutual respect. And like the production designer Arthur Wen, who could make a contemporary desert location look like 1883 with careful attention to what you didn't see rather than what you added. And they had cast the smaller roles carefully with character actors who understood the difference between indicating emotion and embodying it. And then they had come to the question of who would play Deputy Marshal Corrigan. And this was where Marcus Dalton entered the story. Marcus Dalton was 36 years old in September of 2018, and he had what people in the industry called heat, which meant that he had been in 2 successful streaming series and 1 studio film that had performed well enough internationally to make him a name that meant something to financiers. And his agent was a man named Howard Lisk, who had built a career on packaging deals and who saw the Eastwood film as a perfect opportunity to position Dalton for the kind of prestige work that could lead to awards consideration. And Lisk had pushed hard for Dalton to get the role, pointing out that Dalton had the right age and the right look and the recent commercial success that would help the film's foreign sales. And Eastwood had been initially reluctant because he didn't know Dalton's work and preferred to cast actors he had either worked with before or had seen in enough projects to understand their range and their professionalism. But the producers needed a name for the financing to close, and Dalton's screen test had been solid, and Patricia Hammond had called 2 directors who had worked with Dalton, and both had said he was talented and prepared and easy to work with. So Eastwood had approved the casting, and Marcus Dalton had gotten the role of Deputy Marshal James Corrigan without understanding that he was entering a world that operated by rules he had never encountered. Dalton had come out of the New York theater scene where directors encouraged actors to question everything and where rehearsal was a democratic process of discovery and where talking about your process was considered as important as the work itself. And he had transitioned to television where the pace was so fast that there was rarely time for discussion and where actors learned to make strong choices quickly and where the directors were often just traffic cops moving the story from scene to scene. And he had done 1 studio film where the director was a visual effects specialist who seemed more interested in the green screen than the performances. And none of these experiences had prepared him for working with someone like Clint Eastwood, who believed that if you hired good people and gave them clear direction, you didn't need to talk everything to death, and who thought that acting was about doing rather than discussing, and who had no patience for what he considered self-indulgent intellectualizing about craft. The production had begun on September 14, 2018, with a 6 a.m. call time at a location about 90 miles outside of Reno, where the landscape still looked like the 1880s if you pointed the camera in the right direction and avoided the power lines. And the first day's work was scheduled to be the opening sequence where Deputy Marshal Corrigan arrives at a way station to water his horse and hears about the killings at White Rock from the station keeper. And it was a simple scene with only a page and a half of dialogue. And Eastwood's plan was to shoot it in 3 setups and be done by lunchtime. And when Marcus Dalton arrived that first morning at 5:15, he was surprised by how quiet everything was, how there was no visible energy or excitement, just crew members doing their jobs with casual efficiency. And he found that unsettling because he was used to sets where there was more obvious bustle and conversation. And he mentioned this to Patricia Hammond, who was coordinating the morning's logistics. And Patricia had looked at him with an expression that contained both patience and warning, and had said that this was how Eastwood liked to work, quietly and efficiently, and that if everyone did their jobs well, they would be done by 6 p.m. instead of midnight. And Dalton had nodded, but he was already feeling like he needed to do something to establish himself, to show that he was taking the work seriously, to demonstrate that he understood the importance of the role. At 6:30 that morning, Eastwood had gathered the key crew members for a brief discussion of the day's work, and he had explained the 3 camera positions and the natural light they would be using, and the fact that he expected to do no more than 2 or 3 takes of each setup unless something went technically wrong. And then he had walked Dalton through the scene blocking, which was straightforward and based on the natural geography of the location. And Dalton had listened and nodded, and then had asked if they could talk about Corrigan's emotional state in the scene, about whether the character already suspected that his journey might be fatal, about whether there should be a subtext of doom beneath the practical conversation about horses and water. And Eastwood had looked at him for a moment, and then had said that Corrigan was a professional lawman who was doing his job and that the scene was about him getting information. Nothing more complicated than that. and Dalton had wanted to push back, to explain that every scene needed layers, that actors needed to understand the psychological underpinnings of their choices. But something in Eastwood's tone suggested that the conversation was over, and they had moved on to rehearsing the scene. The first take had gone smoothly, with Dalton delivering his lines clearly and hitting his marks and responding naturally to the station keeper, played by a character actor named Tom Bevins, who had worked with Eastwood twice before and knew exactly how to play a scene with no wasted motion. And Eastwood had watched the take on the monitor and then had simply said, "Moving on," which apparently meant they were done with that setup, and Dalton had been confused because he felt like he was just getting warmed up, like he hadn't yet found the emotional core of the moment. And he had approached Eastwood as the crew was shifting to the second camera position and had asked if they could do another take, and Eastwood had asked why, and Dalton had said he thought he could go deeper, and Eastwood had said that deeper wasn't always better, and that the take was good, and that they needed to keep moving. And Dalton had felt dismissed but had accepted it. And they had shot the second setup, which was a close-up on Dalton's reaction as the station keeper described the killings. And again, Eastwood had called, "Moving on," after the first take, and Dalton was beginning to feel like he was in some kind of test that he didn't understand the rules of. And by lunchtime, when they had finished the scene exactly as Eastwood had planned, Dalton was feeling frustrated and underutilized and convinced that the director didn't understand what he was capable of as an actor. During the lunch break, Dalton had sat with some of the younger crew members, people closer to his age who seemed more approachable than the veterans who had worked with Eastwood for decades, and he had started talking about the morning's work. And he had made some jokes about how in the old days, directors apparently just pointed cameras at people and said, "Go," and how there was no exploration of character or motivation. And how he felt like he was in some kind of 1950s production where actors were just expected to say the lines and not ask questions. And a couple of the crew members had laughed politely, but most of them had just looked uncomfortable. And a script supervisor named Rachel Eng, who was eating her lunch nearby, had given him a look that was clearly meant to communicate that he should stop talking. But Dalton had missed the signal, or had chosen to ignore it, and he had continued with his commentary about how different this was from the collaborative environments he was used to, and how he hoped he would eventually get a chance to actually act instead of just reciting words. And it was at this point that Tom Bevins, who had been sitting at the next table over, had stood up and walked away without finishing his lunch. And Dalton had noticed that, but hadn't understood what it meant. The afternoon's work had been scheduled for 2:30 p.m. after the harsh midday sun had moved past its peak, and they were shooting a scene where Corrigan makes camp for the night and reads a letter from his wife. And this was the scene that Bernard Colfax had based on actual letters he had found in a historical society archive. Letters where Martha Corrigan had written to her husband about their daughter's fever and about the wheat crop and about how she prayed for his safety. And Colfax had adapted the letter's language carefully, preserving the plain-spoken directness of how people actually wrote in 1883. And the scene was meant to show Corrigan's isolation and his connection to home, and his awareness that he might not return. And it was all conveyed through his face as he read the letter by firelight and through the letter's simple words that were heard in Martha's voiceover. And Eastwood had explained to Dalton that the scene was about stillness and listening, and that the power came from what Corrigan didn't say rather than what he did. And Dalton had nodded, but privately he had been thinking that this was exactly the kind of scene where an actor needed to bring something, needed to make choices that revealed the character's inner life. And when they had rehearsed the scene, Dalton had started adding small reactions, little facial movements, and shifts in posture that were meant to telegraph specific emotions at specific moments in the letter. And Eastwood had watched the rehearsal and then had asked Dalton to do less, to just sit still and listen to the words. And Dalton had said he understood, but when they shot the first take, he had still included some of his planned reactions, and Eastwood had let the take play out and then had called cut and had walked over to where Dalton was sitting by the prop fire, and he had knelt down next to him so they were at the same eye level. And he had said very quietly, so that only Dalton could hear, that acting wasn't always about doing something, that sometimes the most powerful choice was to do nothing and let the audience come to you, and that the scene would work better if Dalton trusted the words and trusted the camera and just existed in the moment. and Dalton had felt patronized by this advice, felt like he was being treated like a film student instead of an experienced actor. But he had agreed to try it Eastwood's way, and they had shot another take with Dalton doing less, just sitting and listening with minimal expression. And after that take, Eastwood had said, "That's good," and had moved on. And Dalton had felt like he had been neutered as an actor, like his job had been reduced to being a prop that the camera looked at. That evening, after they had wrapped for the day at 6:15 p.m., Dalton had driven back to the hotel in Reno with his assistant Mitchell Grange, who had been with him for 2 years and who understood Dalton's need to process his workday through conversation. And during the 45-minute drive, Dalton had talked extensively about how different this production was from what he was used to, how Eastwood seemed to want automatons instead of actors, how the whole approach felt dated and restrictive, how he was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake accepting the role. And Mitchell had mostly listened because that was his job. And when they had arrived at the hotel, Dalton had gone to the bar and had found several other members of the cast and crew there, including 2 of the supporting actors and a handful of the camera and grip departments. And Dalton had joined them and had ordered a whiskey and had continued his analysis of the day's work. And at some point in the evening, after his second or third drink, Dalton had pulled out his script and had started reading some of Corrigan's dialogue in an exaggerated Old West accent, doing it as a performance for the other people at the bar, treating the script like it was a parody of a Western instead of what it actually was. And some of the younger crew members had laughed because Dalton was being funny and because laughing felt easier than not laughing. But the 2 supporting actors had exchanged glances and had excused themselves shortly after. And Roger Valdez, who had been sitting in a booth across the bar, had watched this performance with an expression of complete neutrality before paying his bill and leaving. And Dalton had been too caught up in his own entertainment to notice that the room was dividing into those who thought he was being amusing and those who thought he was crossing a line. The second day of production on September 15th had started the same way as the first, with a 6 a.m. call time and a quiet, efficient crew preparing for the day's work. And the schedule called for shooting the scene where Corrigan arrives at the outskirts of White Rock and sees the mining camp spread out below him in the valley and makes the decision to ride in alone rather than wait for backup. And it was a scene with no dialogue, just Corrigan on his horse looking down at the camp while the sun rises behind him. And Eastwood had planned to shoot it as a single long take with the camera tracking slowly around Corrigan to see both his face and the valley in the same frame. And when they were setting up the shot at dawn, Dalton had approached Eastwood and had said he had been thinking about this moment and about what Corrigan would be feeling. And he had started to describe his ideas about the character's internal conflict. And Eastwood had listened for about 30 seconds and then had simply said that Corrigan was a man looking at where he needed to go. And that was all the scene required. And Dalton had felt shut down again, and they had shot the scene with Dalton sitting on the horse and looking at the valley while trying to convey nothing except presence. And Eastwood had done 2 takes and then had called it done. And once again, Dalton had felt like his skills were being wasted. By lunchtime on the second day, Dalton's frustration had reached a point where he needed to express it. And during the break, he had found himself near the craft services table with Kevin Morse, who was a 24-year-old production assistant on his first major film and who seemed eager to talk to one of the actors. And Dalton had started venting his frustrations again. And this time, instead of just talking about the directing style in general terms, he had started specifically criticizing the script, saying that Bernard Colfax's writing felt like a first draft, that the dialogue was too on the nose, that real people didn't talk in such simple, direct sentences, that the whole thing needed more subtext and complexity. And Kevin, who didn't know any better, had asked what Dalton meant, and Dalton had pulled out his script and had started reading one of Corrigan's speeches to his wife before he leaves for White Rock. And he had read it in a mocking, sing-song voice, emphasizing what he considered the clunky rhythm of the sentences. And he had been so focused on his performance that he hadn't noticed that Rachel Lang, the script supervisor, had walked up behind him and was standing there listening. And when Dalton had finished his mocking reading, Rachel had said very quietly that maybe Dalton should remember that Bernard Colfax had based that speech on actual words that James Corrigan had said to his wife, according to a witness who had been there. And that maybe those words seemed simple because the man who said them was saying goodbye and knew he might die. and didn't have time for literary flourishes. And Dalton had felt embarrassed, but instead of acknowledging the point, he had doubled down and had said that historical accuracy didn't necessarily make for good drama, and that sometimes you had to improve on reality to make it work on screen. And Rachel had looked at him like he had just revealed something essential about his character, and she had walked away without saying anything else. And Kevin Morse, who had been trapped as the audience for this whole exchange, had mumbled something about needing to check on something and had also left, and Dalton had stood there alone, realizing that he had made some kind of social error, but not fully understanding what it was or why it mattered. The afternoon of the second day had been scheduled for shooting the confrontation scene in White Rock, where Corrigan walks into the saloon where Samuel Pike is drinking and announces that he's there to make an arrest. And it was a tense scene where Pike and his associates realize that Corrigan is alone and start to understand that they have options they wouldn't have if he had brought backup. And the scene was written with very spare dialogue. Just Corrigan stating his business and Pike asking a few questions, and the other men in the saloon staying silent as they calculate the odds. And Eastwood had blocked it very simply, with Corrigan entering through the door and walking to the bar, and Pike sitting at a table with 3 other men and the rest of the saloon patrons moving away to the walls. And they had rehearsed it twice and then had shot the master angle, and it had taken 4 takes because of a technical issue with one of the lamps. And then they had moved on to coverage starting with Pike's point of view, looking at Corrigan. And while they were setting up that shot, the actor playing Pike, a veteran character actor named Dennis Warrenton, who had been in dozens of westerns, had quietly asked Eastwood if he could try a variation where Pike stands up during his first line instead of staying seated. And Eastwood had considered it for about 5 seconds and had said, "Yes, let's try it." And they had done 1 take with Pike standing, and Eastwood had immediately said that was better and had thanked Dennis for the suggestion. And Dalton had watched this exchange with growing irritation, because here was Dennis Warrenton making a suggestion and having it accepted while Dalton's ideas were being dismissed. And the obvious conclusion was that Eastwood respected actors he knew and had worked with before, while treating newer actors like they didn't understand the craft. And this interpretation made sense to Dalton because it confirmed his feeling that he was being undervalued. And it never occurred to him that the difference might be that Dennis had suggested a simple physical choice that served the scene, while Dalton had been trying to add psychological complexity that the scene didn't need. By the end of the second day, when they wrapped at 6:30 p.m., Marcus Dalton had constructed a complete narrative about what was happening on this production. A narrative in which he was a serious actor trying to do meaningful work while being held back by a director who was stuck in an outdated filmmaking style. And this narrative felt true to Dalton because it matched his understanding of how art was supposed to work, and because it positioned him as the misunderstood artist rather than as someone who might be wrong. And that evening at the hotel, he had called his agent Howard Lisk and had vented his frustrations. And Howard had listened and had made sympathetic noises, but had also very carefully suggested that maybe Dalton should try to adapt to Eastwood's style, since there were only 3 weeks of shooting, and since this film could be very important for Dalton's career. And Dalton had agreed intellectually, but emotionally, he was already committed to his interpretation of events, and he had spent the evening in his hotel room, going through the script and making notes about all the places where he thought the writing was weak. And he had even started rewriting some of his dialogue, adding what he considered more naturalistic phrasing and more emotional subtext. And he had gone to sleep that night convinced that eventually Eastwood would recognize his contributions and would appreciate his dedication to improving the material. The third day of production on September 16th was when everything began to actively deteriorate rather than just simmering beneath the surface. And the day's schedule included the scene where Corrigan is shot in the back by one of Pike's men as he's walking out of the saloon after Pike agrees to come peacefully, and it was the climactic action scene of the film. And Eastwood had choreographed it very carefully with the stunt coordinator Manuel Torres, who had worked on 7 of Eastwood's previous films. And the scene required precise timing because there would be squibs and breakaway glass and a complicated fall that Dalton's stunt double would perform. And they had scheduled 2 hours that morning for rehearsing the scene with Dalton and the stunt double and the other actors so that everyone understood exactly where they needed to be and when. The call time was 5:30 a.m. because they needed to catch the early morning light. And when Dalton arrived on set, he found that the crew had already dressed the location to look like 1883 White Rock with false fronts on the buildings and dirt covering the modern road and period-appropriate signage. And Eastwood and Manuel Torres were waiting near the saloon entrance with the stunt coordinator's diagrams of the scene. And they began walking Dalton through the choreography, explaining that he would walk out of the saloon and take 5 steps, and then on the 6th step, he would need to be at a specific mark where the stunt double would take over after a brief cutaway. And Dalton had listened to the explanation and then had said that he wanted to discuss the scene's emotional content before they worried about the technical details. And Eastwood had said they could discuss that after they worked out the safety logistics. And Dalton had persisted, saying that he needed to understand what Corrigan was thinking and feeling in this moment in order to know how to play the walk. And Eastwood had looked at him with an expression that several crew members would later describe as the moment when patience turned to something else. And Eastwood had said very clearly that what Corrigan was thinking was that he had done his job and was going home, and that what Corrigan was feeling was relief and maybe satisfaction, and that those thoughts and feelings would naturally show in how a man walks when he believes the danger has passed, and that Dalton should think less and trust his instincts more. And Dalton had felt insulted by the implication that he was overthinking things. And he had said something about how the great directors like Kazan and Lumet had always encouraged their actors to fully explore their characters' psychology. And Eastwood had just stared at him for a long moment, and then had said, "Let's rehearse the mechanics," in a tone that made it clear the discussion was over. They had spent the next 90 minutes rehearsing the scene, running through it again and again until everyone knew their positions and their timing, and Dalton had become increasingly withdrawn, feeling like he was being treated like a piece of scenery that needed to be moved into position rather than as an artist. And his body language had become obviously sullen, and several of the crew members had noticed and had exchanged concerned glances, because they knew that when an actor started to turn negative like this, it affected everyone's ability to do their jobs. And Patricia Hammond, the first assistant director, had tried to lighten the mood by making a joke about how the early call time meant they would all get to have dinner at a normal hour. But Dalton had barely responded, and the tension had continued to build through the morning. When they finally began shooting the scene at 8 a.m., the first few takes had gone smoothly from a technical standpoint, with Dalton hitting his marks and the timing working out correctly. But Eastwood had called for additional takes because something felt off. And after the 4th take, he had walked over to Dalton and had said that Dalton seemed like he was thinking about something instead of just walking, and that the scene needed Corrigan to be at ease and unguarded, which was why the shooting would be so shocking. And Dalton had said he understood, but his performance hadn't changed, and they had done 3 more takes with the same problem, and finally Eastwood had called for a 30-minute break, and everyone had dispersed to the catering area or the equipment trucks. And Dalton had found himself standing alone near the saloon entrance, feeling angry and misunderstood, and convinced more than ever that he was the only person on this production who actually cared about the quality of the work. It was during this break at approximately 9:45 a.m. that Marcus Dalton made his most significant mistake of the production, the mistake that would directly lead to what happened the next morning. And what made it a mistake wasn't just what he did, but the fact that he did it loudly and publicly in a way that made it impossible for anyone to ignore or to give him the benefit of the doubt. Dalton had walked over to the craft services area where about 15 crew members were getting coffee and breakfast, and he had started talking to Mitchell Grange, his assistant, about how frustrated he was, and Mitchell had tried to quietly suggest that maybe they should talk about this in private, but Dalton was past the point of being careful, and his voice had risen as he talked about how Eastwood's directing style was completely incompatible with serious acting, and how the script was so thin that it gave actors nothing to work with. And then he had pulled out his script and had started reading Corrigan's death scene dialogue, the last words that the character speaks after he's been shot and is lying in the dirt. And these were words that Bernard Colfax had taken directly from a witness account of what James Corrigan had actually said before he died. Simple words about how someone should tell Martha that he did his duty. And Dalton had read these words in a melodramatic, mocking voice, playing them like they were from a bad melodrama. emphasizing what he saw as their corniness and lack of sophistication, and several crew members had turned to look at him with expressions ranging from discomfort to open hostility. And Tom Bevins, who was getting coffee nearby, had set down his cup and had walked away shaking his head. And Rachel Eng had actually said out loud, "That's enough." But Dalton had either not heard her or had chosen to ignore her, and he had continued his performance. And he was getting laughs from a couple of the younger crew members who were nervous and didn't know how else to respond. And Dalton had taken these laughs as encouragement and had continued even more elaborately. And that was when Patricia Hammond had appeared and had very firmly told Dalton that they needed to get back to work, and Dalton had finally stopped. But the damage was done because everyone on that crew now knew that Marcus Dalton thought their work was a joke, and word of what had happened spread quickly through the set. And by lunchtime, everyone, including Clint Eastwood, knew exactly what Dalton had done and exactly what he had said. The afternoon of the third day had been tense and quiet, with crew members doing their jobs with professional efficiency, but with none of the usual casual conversation and camaraderie. And Dalton had sensed that something had shifted, but he had misinterpreted it as everyone being tired or stressed by the demanding schedule. And they had finished shooting the death scene with Dalton delivering Corrigan's final words straight and sincerely, because even he understood that you couldn't mock the lines while actually performing them. And Eastwood had watched these takes from the monitor and had said nothing beyond the technical directions, and they had wrapped at 7 p.m. instead of the planned 6 because the cloud cover had affected the light. And when people had packed up to leave, there had been none of the usual chat about getting dinner or drinks. Everyone had just dispersed quickly, and Dalton had driven back to Reno alone because Mitchell had ridden with someone else. And Dalton had spent the evening in his hotel room feeling confused and isolated and wondering why everyone seemed to be avoiding him. That night at around 10 p.m., Patricia Hammond had called Eastwood at his hotel to inform him officially of what had happened that morning, and Eastwood had listened without interruption. And when Patricia had finished, he had been quiet for a long moment. And then he had asked if she thought Dalton could adjust his attitude and finish the production professionally. And Patricia had said honestly that she didn't know, but that the crew was upset and that continuing with Dalton was going to make the rest of the shoot difficult. And Eastwood had thanked her for the call and had said he would think about it. And after he hung up, he had sat in his hotel room, looking out at the lights of Reno, and thinking about the fact that James Corrigan had been a real person who had died doing a difficult job, and that Bernard Colfax had spent 2 years honoring that person's memory, and that everyone on this crew was working long days in the desert to tell that story truthfully, and that Marcus Dalton had treated all of it like it was beneath him. And sometime around midnight, Eastwood had made his decision about what needed to happen next. The morning of September 17th had started like the previous 3 mornings, with a pre-dawn call time and a crew that assembled quietly in the dark. But there was a different quality to the quiet that morning, a sense that something was going to happen. And Marcus Dalton had arrived at 6:30 a.m., which was 30 minutes after the call time, and had gone immediately to the catering area to get coffee. And he had found Kevin Morse there looking nervous. And Dalton had started talking to Kevin about the day's work. And Kevin had been giving short responses and looking around like he wanted to leave. And Dalton had pulled out his script to show Kevin something. And that was when he had started doing another one of his theatrical readings. Another performance mocking the dialogue, and he had his hand on Kevin's shoulder to keep him there as an audience. And Kevin's face was showing clear distress, and other crew members were watching this happen. And no one was laughing this time, and there was just this terrible silence except for Dalton's voice doing his exaggerated performance. And that was when Clint Eastwood had walked over from where he had been sitting with Roger Valdez. And Eastwood had moved with that same economical purpose that he brought to everything. And he had walked right up to where Dalton was standing, and he had waited for Dalton to notice him. And when Dalton had finally looked up and seen the director standing there, Dalton had actually smiled, had actually assumed that Eastwood had come over for some normal reason. And Dalton had started to say something about just loosening up before work, and he had gone into his explanation about method acting and breaking down scripts and finding truth. And Eastwood had let him talk for maybe 10 seconds. And then Eastwood had spoken, and his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried in the desert morning, and what he said was this: The 6 words that everyone on that set would remember for the rest of their careers. The 6 words that would end Marcus Dalton's involvement in the production and would reverberate through his career for years afterward. And the 6 words were, "Pack your things, you're done here." The silence that followed those 6 words seemed to last forever, even though it was probably only 3 or 4 seconds. And Marcus Dalton's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. First, confusion because surely he had misheard, then comprehension as he understood what had been said, then disbelief because this couldn't actually be happening, and then a flash of anger followed by an attempt to recover with words. And Dalton started to say something about not understanding, about wanting to talk this through, and about how every production had creative differences, and Eastwood just shook his head once, very slightly, and said, "Patricia will handle the details." And then he turned and walked back to the director's chairs, and Patricia Hammond was already approaching with her production coordinator. And she asked Dalton to come with her to the production trailer. And Dalton looked around at the crew members who were watching this happen. And he seemed to be looking for support or sympathy or someone to tell him this was a misunderstanding, but everyone just looked away or looked down at their equipment, and Kevin Morse had already disappeared. And Dalton had no choice but to follow Patricia to the trailer, and by 7:15 a.m., Marcus Dalton was in a production van being driven back to Reno to collect his belongings from the hotel. And by 8 a.m., the crew was back at work shooting the scene that had been scheduled for that day, with Dalton's stunt double standing in for the wide shots. And the mood on set was somber, but also relieved, like a fever had broken. Within 48 hours, the Hollywood trades would report that Marcus Dalton had exited the production of The Long Valley due to creative differences, which was the standard euphemism used in these situations. But within the professional community, the real story spread quickly, not through official channels, but through the network of crew members and actors and technicians who worked together across multiple productions and who talked to each other about who is good to work with and who isn't. And the story that spread was about an actor who had repeatedly mocked a script based on true events, who had treated the crew's work with contempt, who had been warned implicitly through the reactions of his colleagues but had been too self-absorbed to notice, and who had finally been removed from a production by a director who was known for his patience, but who had a hard limit when it came to disrespect. And while the story would get embellished in some tellings and simplified in others, the core of it remained consistent. The image of Clint Eastwood walking across a desert parking lot at dawn and speaking 6 quiet words that ended everything. The production of The Long Valley had continued with Dennis Warrenton taking over the role of Deputy Marshal Corrigan, and Eastwood had made this decision quickly because Dennis understood the character and the tone and had the right weathered quality for the role, and they had reshot the scenes that had already been filmed with Dalton, and the schedule had been extended by 4 days to accommodate the reshoots, and the additional cost had come to approximately $200,000. And no one on the production had complained about the extra work because they all understood that the alternative would have been 3 more weeks of increasing tension and compromised performances. And when The Long Valley was eventually released in late 2019, it was praised for its austere beauty and its respect for the historical reality of frontier law enforcement, and Bernard Colfax's script was nominated for several awards. And Dennis Warrenton's performance as Corrigan was called one of the best of his career, understated and authentic and deeply moving. And in none of the reviews or interviews did anyone mention Marcus Dalton or the fact that he had been replaced during production. For Marcus Dalton, the consequences had been both immediate and long-term. And in the days after he left the production, he had told people that he had quit because of creative differences. But the real story was already circulating. And his agent Howard Lisk had received calls from 3 different directors asking if the story about Dalton mocking the script was true. And Howard had tried to do damage control by explaining that it had been a misunderstanding and that Dalton had just been trying to prepare for his role in his own way. But the fact that Eastwood had fired him was hard to spin. And within 6 months, Dalton found that he was no longer being offered the quality of roles he had been getting before. And his meetings with directors and producers had taken on a different tone, with people asking indirect questions that were clearly meant to assess whether he would be difficult or disruptive, and Dalton had tried to adapt his behavior, to be more cooperative and less vocal about his process. But there was always this question hanging over him, this reputation that he couldn't quite shake, and by 2020 he was mostly working in streaming series again. The same level of work he had been doing before The Long Valley was supposed to elevate him, and he would sometimes in interviews be asked about working with Eastwood, and he would give diplomatic answers about how it had been a learning experience and how he had great respect for the director. But he never told the real story, never explained what had actually happened that morning in the desert. And perhaps that was because explaining it would require admitting that he had been wrong, that he had missed the entire point of what the production was trying to do, that his education and his training and his theoretical understanding of acting had blinded him to the simple truth that sometimes the best performance is the one that gets out of the way of the story. Bernard Colfax had heard about what happened with Dalton from Patricia Hammond, who had called him the day after the firing to explain that there would be delays in reshoots, and Bernard had been upset not because of the schedule changes, but because someone had mocked words that James Corrigan had actually spoken. Words that Bernard had found in letters and witness accounts and had treated as sacred trust. And Bernard had asked Patricia what exactly Dalton had said, and Patricia had told him, and Bernard had been quiet for a long time. And then he had said that maybe it was good that Dalton was gone because someone who couldn't understand the weight of real words probably couldn't have played the role convincingly anyway. And when the film was finished and Bernard had watched it for the first time, he had cried during the death scene because Dennis Warrenton had delivered Corrigan's final words with such simple dignity, with no embellishment or interpretation. Just the words of a dying man who wanted his wife to know he had done his duty. And that was exactly what it should have been. The story of what happened on the set of The Long Valley became one of those industry legends that gets told to young actors and crew members as a cautionary tale about professionalism and respect. And the details vary depending on who's telling it, but certain elements remain consistent. The desert location, the early morning light, the director walking across the parking lot, the 6 quiet words that ended a career trajectory, and what makes the story powerful isn't the drama of the firing itself, but what it represents about the difference between thinking you understand craft and actually understanding it, between believing that complexity makes something better and recognizing that sometimes simplicity is the hardest thing to achieve, between being educated about art and being wise about people. Years later, a film student would ask Clint Eastwood in a Q&A about whether he had ever had to fire an actor during production, and Eastwood would be quiet for a moment, and then he would say that he had once, and that it had been necessary because the actor had forgotten that they were there to serve the story and not the other way around. And the student would ask what advice Eastwood would give to young actors, and Eastwood would say that his advice was simple. Listen more than you talk, trust the material, respect the people you're working with, and remember that acting is about truth and not about showing everyone how much you know about acting. And the audience would applaud, and Eastwood would move on to the next question, and he would never mention Marcus Dalton by name, but everyone in that room who knew the story would understand exactly what he was talking about. The lesson of what happened on September 17th, 2018, at 7:42 in the morning, in a dusty parking lot outside the Silver Basin Ranch in Nevada, is not really about Marcus Dalton or even about Clint Eastwood, but about the nature of respect and the importance of understanding what you're part of when you agree to be part of it, and about the fact that every story being told is someone's story, and if that someone was real and lived and died, then the least you can do is treat their story with the dignity it deserves. And Marcus Dalton had failed to do that, had treated James Corrigan's actual words and actual death as material for his own artistic exploration, had failed to see that Bernard Colfax's simple direct dialogue was simple and direct, because that's how people actually talked, and because sometimes reality doesn't need to be improved. And he had failed to notice that everyone around him, from Clint Eastwood to the production assistants, understood this and was trying to honor it. And that failure of understanding had cost him more than just one role on one film. It had cost him the trajectory of his career and the respect of his peers, and all because he couldn't stop talking long enough to listen, couldn't stop performing long enough to simply be, couldn't recognize that the 6 words Clint Eastwood spoke to him that morning "Pack your things, you're done here," were the gentlest version of what everyone else on that set had wanted to say to him for 3 days, and were spoken quietly, not because Eastwood was trying to be dramatic, but because that's how you tell someone difficult truth, with certainty and without cruelty, with finality and without negotiation. With the understanding that sometimes the most important thing a director can do is protect the story and the people telling it from someone who doesn't understand what they're there to do. And if you're an actor or a crew member or anyone who works in this industry, the question you have to ask yourself is whether you would have recognized what Marcus Dalton did wrong before it was too late, and whether you have the humility to serve the story instead of using it to serve yourself. Because that's the real difference between the people who have long careers in this business and the people who get 6 quiet words that change everything.